She thought it was just clay, but the moment her hands touched it, the whispers began, and the shadows came alive. The studio had always been silent, but tonight it was alive in ways Grace could not explain. Once a cluttered storage space, it had taken her weeks to clear it. Boxes of Matthew's old files, broken chairs, and trunks of forgotten belongings were dragged out one by one until only bare shelves remained. She had wanted a sanctuary, a place of her own where she could sit with her thoughts during the late stages of her pregnancy. The single window let in the pale light of the moon, painting the cracked plaster walls in silver. Candles glowed on the work table, their flames bending against the faint draft that whistled through the wood. Grace sat before a lump of clay she had bought months ago, back when she imagined taking sculpting classes. Those classes had ended after only a few weeks. Fatigue, backaches, and nausea had taken over. Yet tonight, the clay called to her. She did not know why, only that she couldn't ignore it. Her hands pressed into the cold mass. At her feet, Cooper, their golden retriever, shifted, placing his head on her knee. His ears twitched toward the shadows, his body tense, though no one else was there. The clay shifted beneath her palms with a strange resistance, like flesh. And then, slowly, a face began to emerge. Not just any face, Matthew's. Grace's heart skipped. She was no artist, yet the likeness was flawless. His jaw, his eyes, the curve of his mouth. She felt as if she were touching him, as if he were trapped inside the clay. Cooper growled low, staring into the darkest corner of the room. Grace whispered, almost to herself, This isn't right." That night, when Matthew came home long past midnight, she feigned sleep. She couldn't tell him what she had seen, couldn't admit the unease creeping into her chest. The next evening, she returned. The sculpture was not hardened, though it should have been. The clay remained supple, pliant, waiting. Her hands shook as she touched it. The figure shifted, reshaping into something new. She saw Matthew sitting at an office desk she had never visited, papers scattered, tie loose, his face weary. And then, another figure leaned over his shoulder. Linda. Grace froze. Linda's name had slipped into conversation before, mentioned as a colleague. Seeing her now, so close, smiling at Matthew, made jealousy surge hot in her chest. But the clay Matthew never turned toward Linda. His gaze stayed on his work, his shoulders stiff with discomfort. Relief mixed with confusion. The wind howled against the window. Shadows stretched unnaturally, and for a moment whispers filled the room, low, indistinct, but urgent. Cooper barked sharply, silencing them. Grace stumbled back from the table, breath uneven. The clay pulsed as though alive. Night after night, the ritual repeated. The clay never hardened. Each time it revealed more. Matthew at their kitchen table, drinking from his chipped blue mug, worry etched across his face. Matthew standing at their bedside, watching her sleep with a tenderness she hadn't noticed. Matthew at work, his hand brushing Linda away as he buried himself in tasks. The visions unsettled her not because of betrayal, but because they showed her the opposite, devotion she had doubted. And yet the hauntings worsened. Candles snuffed out on their own. The air turned icy, mist curling from her lips. The shadows thickened into shapes that almost looked human. The whispers grew clearer. Trust, trust, trust. Her hands pressed harder into the clay, as though seeking answers. Heat seared her palms, and visions stormed through her mind. Her wedding night, Matthew carrying her over the threshold. Matthew panicked at the hospital when she fainted early in pregnancy. Matthew turning away from Linda, firm, unyielding. The voices thundered now. "See the truth!" Grace screamed, slamming her fists into the clay. The figure collapsed. Silence swallowed the room, broken only by her sobs. Cooper pressed close, whining, as though urging her to understand, and deep down, she did. The clay wasn't exposing Matthew, it was exposing her. Her silence, her fear, her lack of trust. Grace avoided the studio for days, but the pull was unbearable. When she returned, the air was gentler, the shadows calmer. The clay sat waiting, still soft. Her hands touched it, and for once, she sculpted freely. Matthew appeared, devotion in his eyes. She appeared beside him, her hand in his. Linda lingered in the background, blurred, irrelevant. The whispers, no longer harsh, washed over her like a lullaby. Trust, love, remember. Grace touched the sculpture and whispered, "I see you now." The candles steadied. The shadows sighed, then withdrew. But in her heart she knew this was only the beginning. One evening, when the house was unusually still, she gave in. Candles flickered weakly as she stepped into the studio. The air was colder than before, and Cooper whined at the threshold, refusing to enter. The sculpture she had left, Matthew and her, hands entwined, was gone. The clay sat raw again, a fresh mound, as if mocking her. Her heart thudded. She reached out. The moment her hands touched, the clay burned hot, and visions erupted so violently she staggered back. She saw Matthew in their bedroom, but not watching her tenderly this time. He was crying, face buried in his hands, alone, silent, crushed beneath a weight he never voiced. Then another image, herself, distant and cold, suspicion in her eyes every time he came home late. More visions followed in rapid flashes. Matthew sitting at work, ignoring Linda, yet glancing at his phone, waiting for Grace's messages that never came. Matthew lingering outside their bedroom door, wanting to enter, but retreating when she turned her back. Matthew holding a tiny pair of baby shoes, smiling faintly, whispering to himself, "I'll be enough. I have to be." The clay throbbed under her palms as if alive, as if it carried his very heartbeat. The whispers surged louder than ever. "See him! Trust him! Love him!" The shadows in the room thickened, stretching tall, human-like, closing in around her. Their mouths moved, though no sound came, faces shifting between familiar and monstrous. Grace clutched her belly instinctively, her unborn child kicking as if sensing the storm. "Stop!" she screamed. "I understand! I understand!" The haunting, but the clay was relentless. It pulled her deeper. She saw herself in the hospital, pale and weak, Matthew gripping her hand, refusing to leave even when doctors urged him out. She saw him signing late-night paperwork at work, the ink smudged from his tired hands. She saw him turning away from every temptation, clinging to loyalty like a lifeline. Yet through it all, she also saw her own mistrust, the distance she had built like bricks in a wall. Tears streamed down her face. "I've been blind. It wasn't you, Matthew. It was me." The shadows stilled, the whispers hushed, as if waiting. Grace pressed into the clay one last time. This time, her hands didn't shake. She sculpted slowly, deliberately. The form rose clearer than ever. Matthew, holding their child, smiling with pride, herself beside him, their shoulders touching, and Cooper, lying at their feet, faithful and watchful. The figures glowed faintly in the candlelight, and for the first time, the room felt warm. A soft sigh rippled through the studio. The shadows receded, folding back into the corners until they were gone. The whispers melted into silence. The clay finally stilled. The resolution. The next morning, Matthew returned home early, a rare sight. His tie was loosened, his eyes heavy. He looked at Grace as though searching for something, anger, suspicion, or distance. Instead, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. Tears dampened his shirt as she whispered, "I trust you. I see you." "I'm sorry I didn't," before he froze, then held her so tightly she thought she might break. But instead, something inside her mended. From that day, the house shifted. Matthew came home earlier when he could. Grace met him with softer eyes, listening, sharing, letting the walls between them crumble. When their child was born, tiny, crying, alive, Matthew never left her side. Cooper curled by the hospital bed like a sentinel. Grace felt whole in a way she hadn't in months. The final visit. Weeks later, Grace returned to the studio one last time, The shelves now held the sculptures she had made, but the clay sat motionless, ordinary at last. She touched it gently, half expecting it to pulse or shift. But it was just clay now. The hauntings were over. Still, the figures she had sculpted remained. Matthew, herself, their baby, and Cooper. Proof of truth, proof of love. Grace smiled softly. Thank you. As she left, the candle flame wavered. The shadows rippled once, almost like a bow, before settling into peace. Epilogue. That night, as Matthew rocked the baby in his arms and Cooper snored at their feet, Grace whispered into the quiet, "The clay never lied. It only showed me what I was too afraid to see." She kissed Matthew's cheek, brushed her hand over her child's tiny fingers, and let herself believe fully, for the first time, that they were safe, together, unbreakable. The studio stayed silent. The shadows never stirred again. The clay never lied. It only showed the truth she was too afraid to see. Now tell me, if your hands touched clay that sculpted your darkest secrets, would you dare to look? Drop your answer in the comments, if you're brave enough.